Thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence. We're a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to helping you streamline your RFP process through better education, smarter strategies, and more transparency. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive training, discounts to our virtual and in-person events, and the chance to connect with other procurement professionals throughout the year. And if you're planning a professional event or conference, don't forget our CPE Speakers Bureau is available to speak at regional and national gatherings. Now let's get into today's session of Ask the RFP Doctor, where one of our expert RFP doctors will show you how to take on real-world challenges in procurement and supply chain management and break them down into practical strategies you can use right away.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
So today we're talking about the known unknowns, and I'll explain what that means. But basic premise here is there's no such thing as an absolutely 110% perfect RFP. There's usually something that's going to come up that is either unexpected or just we didn't know about it or perfectly have it defined up front. So we're not going to talk especially about the surprises or the things that come completely out of left field today. We're going to talk about the known unknowns, and I'll define that in a moment, and what we can do about them in our processes for our RFP. Now, outline of what we're going to do. We'll first define what is a known unknown, so we're all on the same page with that. Then I'll talk about where do these things pop up during the RFP process or timeline itself, so make sure that that is clear as well. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about what can we in procurement actually do about these things. Is there anything we can do? The spoiler alert is absolutely yes, there's a lot we can actually do, and we'll talk through that with some actual examples. And we'll summarize things and close out the day together. So first up, what is a known unknown? So I'll give a bit of a definition and we'll do a whole bunch of explanation and give some examples and illustrate this point. You're welcome to throw in the chat any additional ideas that you may have or a better way to define this. I totally made this up. So if it's not quite clear, let us know. And I'm sure that will get addressed in the chat from all the other smart professionals with procurement backgrounds here online with us. But here's my definition. This is information that the client's team, this could be the procurement professional working on the RFP, it could be your internal project team, user group, agency, end user, anyone who's involved with that project that's about to go out and be solicited via RFP. This could be any information that's going to be pertinent to the actual delivery of the project itself. But then there's a big but here. You cannot know, quantify, define, measure, or uncover this information until after you sign a contract with a supplier. That's my definition, is something that's important or pertinent, but you're not going to be able to pin it down until after a contract is signed. And I'll play with this a little bit further and try to flesh it out. So let's hit that pertinent part. What I mean by a bit of information that is pertinent is it's pertinent to the delivery of the project because this is something that might influence the cost of the project, the schedule of the project, your client satisfaction with how that project's being delivered, or any other aspect of truly executing the work. When you hire that supplier to come in and do that work for you, whatever it is, a service contract, an O&M contract, a construction contract, professional services, whatever the case may be, IT, when you actually have that vendor under contract, that supplier under contract, and they're doing their work, as we all know, stuff can come up, and that's where you get into change orders and contract mods and things like that. Well, when do you modify that contract? It's when something affects cost or schedule or scope or satisfaction. So it's that kind of information. So it's important enough that if we don't find out about it until after the contract is signed, we are likely into a change order type of negotiation at that point. But the catch here with these known unknowns is this is stuff that we can't perfectly nail down or define until after we've signed the contract with that supplier. So we may be aware that there is some pertinent information that needs to get figured out for our project, but we may also be resigned to the fact that we can't figure that information out until later once a supplier is on board with us. And maybe give a few examples here that are probably the most common types of known unknowns. So the first one, which should be pretty obvious, that will illustrate the point, is any type of concealed condition. So if your project involves digging below the ground or opening up a wall in an existing facility, or if it requires doing a little bit of demo work, poking around, doing some test holes here, that kind of stuff, you know that you might find something unexpected below ground, below grade, or behind that wall, or above that ceiling, or once we demo this thing or that thing or whatever. But typically, you're not going to find that out until your supplier is already on site because they're contracted to do that work, do that digging, do that demo, or whatever. And we don't always have the luxury of chunking this out as public sector agencies into separate contracts. You know, we're just going to sign a contract for some exploratory work and minimal demo, and then wait a while to use that information to go do another procurement to bring in the separate supplier to finish the work. You normally are bundling that in, excuse me, to the contract. So that kind of stuff is, yeah, we know we might find something unexpected below ground or behind that wall or above that ceiling, but we're not going to determine that until the supplier's on site and doing that work for us. So that's an obvious one for a known unknown. Another one is dependencies on other stakeholders performing their work. If you have separate contracts to separate suppliers, but their work is intertwined in some way, shape, or form, then it would be absolutely expected and actually pertinent or responsible, I would say, for one of those suppliers to say, hey, some of my work depends upon, that team over there. And what if they're late? What if they mess up? What if something doesn't go as planned? That's going to affect my work. I don't know if that's going to happen until that other team starts delivering, and I don't know until they hand it over to me, but that could occur. So that's another way where you could see those handoff points being a challenge. And then a third example would be, is there information that you as the client ideally would have gathered and provided to the supplier or bidding community to help them price things out? So these would be things that help quantify or define or detail your scope, but you just couldn't take the time to gather it up front. I'll share some examples of what that would look like here in a moment. Another thing would be, sometimes you do have some investigatory work that needs to get done or a discovery phase or things like that, but you don't want to wait and you want to bundle that into your contract that you're competing for the bigger piece of the pie contract. And so that type of stuff is, there's going to be things that come up during those investigations or discovery phases, but that can't be known yet. So those are a few, and there's some others. So Shane mentioned that they've got a known unknown. One of your hamlets, there's a sewer waterworks under the street, but you just don't know where and what's down there for sure. That's a great example. And I've got some that are similar to that here as well. That's a perfect example. Something's down there, so it's known. So we're not talking purely surprise here. It's just that what the condition of that sewer waterwork line under the street actually is, where it specifically is located, what might need to be done to it, all that kind of stuff may not be perfectly known yet. And so there's a bit of lack of definition there just because of the physical constraints of the job. That's precisely right. So I'll show some real examples here and how to address them as we get going. But maybe the first thing that we want to talk about too is, why can't the client get this information before getting a supplier under contract? Well, some of this is that getting the information requires performing the work itself, right? So in Shane's example, we got to start excavating under the road before we figure out what's down there. And typically, most public sector groups don't want to start excavating the road and impeding the traveling public until, for as short a period as possible. So you don't want to have like this exploratory phase and things are opened up, and then, oh, by the way, we'll go back and we'll compete the contract and bring in the contractor to do the work. Like, no, let's just get this done in and out as fast as possible. We all know and agree that there's an unknown down there. Really, the question is, what's the proper way to handle that scenario? Because it's going to come up a lot. So that's the discussion for today. Another thing that can pop up is just purely funding restrictions. It can cost money to do those investigations up front, or to perform that analysis up front, or to gather that information up front. And sometimes your funding is tied to the specific project itself, and you can't release a smaller chunk of those funds up front to do that investigatory work. So you just have to lump it all together. That's part of it. I'll share examples of that as well. Supplier expertise is part of it. Is sometimes you don't know something and you're aware of that as a client, but you need somebody to help you to figure it out, or to quantify it, or to measure it, or whatever. Another just practical one is, as we all know, if we spent more time scoping and gathering requirements for every one of our projects, then we would probably have a better, more thorough scope. But we can't just wait until we think it's perfect. Sometimes you just have to take what's good enough and get it released to the street and foster a good competition from the supplier community. And so some of this stuff, you look at it and you're like, yeah, it would be nice if we had that information in our scope that we could release for competition, but that would take us 2 months of work to go and catalog all that stuff, or figure out that equipment and so on. And so you just decide that juice is not worth the squeeze, basically. So there's other scenarios, but those are some of the reasons why you can't do it until after a contract has been signed. So when does this stuff pop up? So when do these known unknowns pop up? I'm going to give you three different answers to that question. The first answer is, and this is the real answer, this stuff can pop up at any time. When somebody has that little epiphany or light bulb moment and realizes, oh, we didn't define that, or we didn't spec that out, or whatever, that could happen at any time. So something pertinent can always be brought to your attention during the RFP process. This could be by a supplier's question during the Q&A period. It could be just a light bulb moment from your internal project team. Somebody was like, hey, I noticed we didn't talk about this in the scope, or did you consider that? And you're like, oh, no, we missed that, so let's talk about it. So it can always come up. But the more practical answer are there are three specific points in time that you as a procurement professional should be thinking about known unknowns and thinking about, do I have any of them, and how can I try to address them as a part of this individual RFP process. So the first is during the planning phase before the RFP is released. That's pretty obvious. While you're scoping things out and gathering requirements, you're going to think, is there anything that we would like to have in our scope, but we just can't take the time or we don't know the answer to it? Number two would be during the evaluation phase. This usually has some interaction with the suppliers at that point, where they're either submitting a question to you or they say something in an interview or a demo, and you're like, whoa, we didn't catch that. We didn't think about that. And it may not be a total surprise. We must be like, yeah, that supplier made a good point, or they asked a good question. That's something that would be ideal to get figured out here in our scope. And of course, things can come up during the negotiation process. A lot of time you have unknown elements that you knew about from planning the RFP and building the scope, or it came up during the evaluation phase. Usually the negotiation phase is where you actually address these items in a more optimal way in your contract language. And I'll talk about that and share some examples here as we get going. But to visualize this on a timeline, so the first step here of your planning phase, that's when you're putting together your statement of work. And those of you who have seen CPE trainings before know that we are also big sticklers about putting together your current conditions or your current state environment and capturing that and building that into your RFP. Oftentimes, you'll be going through that scoping or requirements gathering exercise with your project teams. And we in procurement are looking for things that were like, hey, do they know this? Is that volume going to be important? Is that quantity going to be important for the supplier's pricing? Usually, we in procurement have good instincts about what's going to influence pricing with the suppliers. And so we're looking out for quantities, user counts, whatever, that may not be perfectly defined in that scope to say, hey, is this something that we need to track down? Do we need to go get that? Or are we just not going to take the time to find that information? We have to find some way to address that in our scope. That's where one will come up is here. The next thing would be during your Q&A period, once the RFP is published, or in proposals. Sometimes you read something in a proposal that a supplier points out another known unknown, or it comes up during the evaluation period where you're in interviews or demos or things like that, as I mentioned. So that's another area where you're usually, in those cases, you're typically getting feedback from suppliers that's triggering the recognition that there is a known unknown that has not yet been addressed. And then, of course, during a negotiation phase, things can come up as well. So those are going to be the three areas, just visualizing it. So again, you can discover these known unknowns in all three phases. That's the more practical answer here, is where they're coming up. Now, there's also a philosophical answer. So I gave you the real answer is like stuff can come up anytime. The practical answer is usually in each one of those three chunks of time during your RFP. The practical or philosophical answer now, I should say, is that if you find a known unknown before you signed the contracts, that's always good news. Sometimes we feel surprised or taken off guard, or we don't like the fact that our organization is unable to define something or quantify something, and it makes us feel like, maybe we're not as good at our jobs, or we should have done this, or it makes us look bad as a client because we couldn't even define our own scope or our own historic transactions or the number of equipment that are going to be involved in this upcoming project or whatever, or a big inventory of the quality and status of that equipment. You can think of all these different scenarios where you as a client organization couldn't take the time to perfectly document everything. And that can make us feel icky sometimes, especially if you get a question from a supplier that says, hey, you didn't define this in your scope, but it's going to need to be defined. What should we do about it? And that can catch us off guard. The real proper way to think about this is don't overreact. You should think, thank you, supplier. Thank you for pointing that out. It is always better to find this stuff before you've signed the dotted line of a contract. Now, why do I say that? Well, you're going to find out this stuff later during the execution of the work at some point or another. So do you want to know about it up front, and plan for it and build it into your execution approach and ideally even have it under contract? Or do you want to wait till you're in the middle of the project? There's a little bit more stress, there's money at stake, and now you are already contractually tied and obligated to a single supplier. You have no negotiating room, really. It's just one-on-one. There's no competitive aspect of this. So the more you find out about this stuff up front, the more you can get it into a competitive arena, the more you can get multiple perspectives on it, and it helps you solve the challenge. So that's probably the hardest part of this whole topic, is to think to ourselves, if we find out a known unknown, that's not a scary thing necessarily. If we've picked it up before the contract is signed, that's actually a sign of us doing a good job in our RFP process. So let's get more practical. What can we actually do about this stuff once it pops up? Now, I'll share some examples, just a few examples. I picked mostly construction-oriented, facility-oriented type of examples because I think they're easy to visualize. But this all is pertinent to really any type of RFP that you do, whether it's services, whether it's consulting services, whether it's IT services, whatever, you name it, the principles still apply. These are just examples to help illustrate the point. Yeah, ERP, don't even get us going on that. Okay. Here's a first example. This is going to be an example of a duo or a combination known unknown. So this was simultaneously a scope gap and a concealed condition issue. And going back to our timeline, this example I'm going to show you, it popped up in the supplier's proposal. So we got a proposal back from a supplier that pointed this out to us in their actual written proposal. So that was the first time we were really hearing about this in greater detail, is when we were evaluating the proposals, which thankfully then we could ask about it in the interviews and so on. But basically what this was is we were excavating contaminated sites, and we had produced, as the client organization, we had released an environmental report, a contamination report, as an appendix to the RFP. And most of the suppliers responding to the RFP said, hey, there could be other contaminants down there once we start excavating that were not captured in the environmental report, right? The environmental report took 6 borings of the site, and that's pretty limited. There might be other stuff down there, so we're going to have to figure it out. Now, this is what you don't want to see from your supplier. One of them says, hey, there might be other stuff down there of a variety of types, and that's a risk, because if we find stuff, it's going to impact your budget and your schedule. So our solution is going to be that we'll just sleep by our phones and call each other when stuff comes up. They have given you no information about what could feasibly be down there that is different than what was already identified on the environmental report. They've given no actual plan of how we're going to handle this other than sleep by your phone. So this is not a very good example, but it is still a true item that was occurring, or a situation that's happening on our project. This is what the winner actually said on that specific project. They said, hey, in particular, there's this specific type of contaminant. I'll spare you the details and the technical background of the project, but there's this particular type of contaminant that was not identified on the environmental consultant's report of contaminants. And the reason why this specific contaminant is a big deal is we're going to have to send any debris that is contaminated with this to an out-of-state disposal facility, which means it's going to affect shipping costs and getting things off sites. It's a higher level of contamination that has to be addressed. And then in their proposal, they said that their plan was they'll perform some excavations and sampling early in the schedule to figure it out. So that was good enough as far as it goes in the proposal. They were more specific. They identified something that was beyond what was written in our RFP scope, from our environmental consultant. They actually pointed something out that was specific and pertinent, but what I'm going to key on here is the plan. So we go through the evaluation process. We actually end up selecting this contractor, for multiple other reasons. But now we're in the negotiation phase. And so we come back and say, hey, remember how you wrote this in your proposal? And this was your plan. So I'm highlighting the plan here. It was just, we'll do some stuff early. And at that point, the question was, can we get a better plan together than this? Because in my opinion, this is not a legitimate plan. This is just a, hey, we'll find out later type of acknowledgments, which is true, but let's get this plan better. And so I'm going to show you what we did and how we worked through this together during the contract negotiation to flesh this out, get a more legitimate plan, and we actually built it into the contract as a part of that negotiation process. So this is what we wrote. They said, okay, when you say back here, we're going to do exterior wall excavation sampling early in the schedule. What does that mean? Is like 1 week early in the schedule, or is 1 month early in the schedule? What does that actually mean? So they had put a date. We're going to know by this time. So you don't have to sleep by your phone. On this day is the day we're going to know the answer down there. We're going to confirm what's down there. And then they had done some scenarios of, if we find this particular contaminant down here. Here's the actual impact on schedule and costs that we would expect to incur. And we built that out. And we reviewed that. There was more than just a couple bullet points here. We didn't just blindly trust this. There was some more homework going on here. But this then went, to the board for approval. That was built into the budget and contingencies, and we are all set. You wouldn't have to pause the project. You wouldn't have to be surprised. You wouldn't have to go back to, city commission or the board of directors in this case and get more money. It was all known up front. And the nice thing too is think about the timing when we got these impacts put together. It was in a calm contract negotiation environment. There's not work going on site. You don't have equipment and crews who are waiting on an answer to this question when it came up. We knew about it in advance, and the contract was not yet signed, so there was at least some competitive pressure remaining to that supplier to give us a fair and accurate price. Otherwise, we may not have been comfortable signing the contract to begin with. And this is the moral of the story of how to approach things, is something like this. Okay. Now, another one was a quantity that could not be fully quantified until the work was performed. It's another construction example. I don't know if we have any folks joining us from lovely Dalhousie University up in the Maritime provinces near Halifax, or in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But we worked together for many years. This is one of the beautiful, iconic campus buildings they have, the Henry Hicks building. Give you a few different views of it. So just notice the stonework and the general size, and you can see some of the stonework in here. Well, one of the projects that we had helped them to scope and procure at the time was a full revitalization of all the stonework and masonry work around this iconic building. And so one of the things that was pointed out is that this was a 4-year-long contract due to the size of the building and the restrictions on when the crews could actually be working on the exterior facade. Essentially what was happening is they were doing the work over summers, and it was just too much work to get done in any single summer. It took them 4 years. Decent chunk of money, and this is a while back, so you're pushing north of 10 million in today's dollars for sure. And I've given you a literal PDF screenshot here of our final contract, which is more detail behind it, but that's why it's a little blurry here on the screen. Is this is literally what was in the contract itself. So we said, as they're doing these repairs, it is impossible to perfectly quantify the amount of grout, back pointing, sandstone repairs, and masonry ties that are going to have to occur as they work through this whole effort. So all of that stuff is, they're going to find out as they go. Now, they said before every phase, they're going to do some test holes and testing of it so we can be more informed of this. Here's how they're going to perform stuff that comes up that requires that extra grout and so on and so forth. They're going to track these quantities, and I'll spare you some of the details. They estimated out what the potential impact to schedule could be per phase and what the cost could be, and they built out their contingency to be, organized in the contract itself. So you may have times where there's an unknown quantity in your scope, and you know that quantity directly drives pricing. So how do you build that in? Like, that's a known unknown. I know this is going to be something that drives price, but I can't perfectly dial it in now. Well, it's a good time up front to have that discussion and get that built in so you know ahead of time how it's going to be addressed and tracked. Another one that came up was a question during the Q&A period of an RFP that I was assisting with. This one I think is pretty similar to Shane's example, but it was for a new building, and one of the suppliers said, hey, we're tying into the existing water infrastructure in your area. What is the existing water pressure, and is it enough for this new building that we're going to be designing and constructing? And the actual answer that we had as a client team was, don't know. We had no idea. That was the true answer. Like, the real answer, if we were being honest, was, we have no idea, please help. That was actually our where our head was at. But that's not pertinent procurement practice. So here's what we did. We said, for the purposes of the proposal, proposers should assume that the existing water pressure is adequate. So let's just take it off the table. Let's take the guesswork off the table. Let's assume it's good, so you don't have to worry about anything. We don't have suppliers or proposers who are pricing in different guesses of contingency here. We want stuff to be as apples to apples as possible. But that also means we've got some work to do during negotiations of how are we going to handle this item? Is there a contingency to be built in for this? What happens if the water pressure is not adequate? Just because we wrote that in an RFI response doesn't make it true. We knew the answer was we don't know, but we kept it like that to keep the process moving along. Now, in an ideal world, if we wanted perfect information, we could have just done timeout, stopped the whole procurement process. Let's go down there, let's excavate, let's figure this out, and then we'll come back and post an addendum. But who wants to do that? Who wants to slow down an entire project for one question here? So we've kept it apples to apples, leveled proposals here, but we do need to remember to come back and address this during negotiations. So in procurement, keeping track of these types of items to help inform your negotiation stage is a critical task. Do not assume that your project team and project manager is going to keep track of these items, because that's just not going to be the case. Last but not least here would be a concealed condition tied to funding itself. And this is another example of why sometimes you can't figure this stuff out. This was a high school we were helping, and this is also similar, where they didn't know this is a separate project than the prior example, but they didn't know the water pressure for this new high school they were building. And the industry in this case all came back, and the supplier said, hey, client, you should go figure this out now. It's going to be easier for all of us to price this in and to understand what's going on. If you just go do the investigation work now, it's only going to take a few weeks to get it done. Go hire an environmental consultant to come out here and figure this out. Unfortunately, for various funding reasons, the client could not do that. They did not have the money. They had to release that investigation work under the master contract itself. So we just had to say, sorry, we openly admit that we don't know, and let's just assume that the water is fine. But most people knew that was not going to be the case. So the winning design build team, or CM team in that case, came out and said, hey, we're going to do those investigations within the first few weeks, but there's really 3 potential outcomes. One outcome is, best case, we get out there, we find that there's adequate water pressure. That way we can devote all the budget that the client has to designing and building the best possible project for the future students. More likely is that we're going to get out there and we're going to find that there's some inadequate water pressure. We're going to have to devote some of the budget to address that and improve or enhance the water infrastructure, which is going to, if you can't find more budget, client, then that's going to come at the cost of some building parameters. We might need to be a smaller building or less, lower quality of finishes or whatever. We can probably get to pretty close square footage in terms of programmatic use of the high school, but it's not going to be as nice and pristine as we originally expected, because we're taking money and dealing with this water issue. And of course, the worst case is if we have to really invest a lot of money into this, then there's going to be significant impacts, and here's what they're going to be. And so that all transpired. We ended up going through, we selected one of the contractors. We briefed in this case, the board of directors on this issue. We prepped it all up ahead of time. And then number 2 most likely ended up being what happened is we got out there, we had to devote a chunk of the budget towards sprucing up or enhancing the water pressure and infrastructure. We went back to the board of approval and said, yep, we went out there exactly when we said. We found what we thought we were going to find. Here's the budget impacts. And then the board of directors actually put that approval for the extra money on the consent agenda and didn't even discuss it. So imagine that, right? Like you have an unexpected, somewhat, surprise early in the project that takes extra money that you have to go deal with. And you're not having to get up there and, in a scared fashion sometimes, or intimidated fashion sometimes, present to the board of directors. They're like, yep, we knew about that. It's all good. It's not a surprise. We don't even have to discuss it. Put it on the consent agenda and approve it in 2 seconds. So sometimes that's internal pain can be avoided just because you've done a good job identifying these things up front and getting them out in the open. Even if you can't perfectly identify them, that is okay. Just getting them out there and known that this could happen is a big deal. So those are some examples. Those are all mostly construction facilities related. You can, of course, have examples like this in services, operations, maintenance, IT deployments, and so on. I saw the ERP comment in there as well. Things like user counts or number of prior transactions or historic volumes of things. Oftentimes, we don't know that perfectly, and it's hard for us to go get that information. Anything that's in an O&M or service arena where you have to go do a catalog of existing infrastructure that you have as a client. So we've done examples of like citywide print services contracts that we've helped with, where the suppliers want to know, how many devices do you have? Where are they located? What is their condition? And pretty much, well, I will say every city and public sector client that we've worked with in that type of scenario, their answer is we don't know. And it's like, do you go and bring the interns in and work on that for 6 months to catalog it? Or how do you handle that, right? So that type of stuff happens. I've seen it happen in O&M contracts as well. Hey, we're doing a new O&M contract for HVAC repair services across an entire campus or a city. Who are we bringing on? Well, they want to know current status and volume of work and things like that. So you may not know all that stuff up front. So it can happen in any type of RFP is my main point. And again, That brings us back to the main philosophical thing here is if you find one of these known unknowns before you sign the contract, that is always good news. It is always good to find out about it earlier, before you are under contract, before it's a change order, before it's interrupting the flow of work. The earlier you know, time absolutely has value in these scenarios. Now, another thing I will mention is if you've attended any CPE trainings, especially where we go through our statement of work or scope of work training, one of the things you'll notice that we include in the 5 most important things to have in your statement of work is what we call unique considerations. And one of the ways we define that is stuff that is unknown or is just an assumption, right? So assume the water pressure is accurate, or hey, we don't know this count, so let's assume blah, blah, blah is the right number for use in the proposal process. The reason we have that in there is to explicitly acknowledge and check with our project teams before we even release the RFP. What unknowns or assumptions did we make in our scope? It may not mean that we are a unique or unusual clients to the suppliers, but it's just one piece of information that other clients might know that we don't know, and we're going to be upfront about that. You do not want to sweep this under the rug and hide it in your scoping process. You want to come right out and identify it, and ideally give a good benchmark for the suppliers to use for the purposes of their proposal. That's the idea. And these known unknowns can occur in the scope, or it could be your current condition. So I gave you a bunch of current condition, current state examples, right? Of, what's the catalog of existing equipment or materials that we have across our city or our campus, and what's their condition, and how many do we have, of what types. That catalog of existing things is your current condition being either defined or not defined in a known unknown case. So to summarize, you will encounter known unknowns in your procurement career. There's no way around it. It's going to happen. And there's a lot that we can do to be proactive, especially in that scope and requirements gathering phase. As we're developing that scope, you can be watching out for these things and asking those questions. Also be ready, though. You can do the best job that you can on the scoping and requirement gathering phase, but you might get a question that comes up from the suppliers. You might get something that gets brought up in the proposal process or in an interview, and that's totally okay. And in fact, it's somewhat expected, right? Like, as a client, we did our best job to develop the scope, but now we have a bunch of industry experts analyzing that scope, pricing that scope, planning a schedule around that scope. I would hope that they're really thinking through things. So when they bring something up that we didn't consider as a client, I have seen numerous project teams react in a negative fashion. Why did they mention that? Or I don't want to say anything because that makes us look bad because we don't know the answer. Like, no, you should be totally thankful and approach that as this is a big win for the project that we fleshed this out early enough. And then the idea of building an actionable plan into your contracts takes practice and skill. So you have to teach your internal project teams and your suppliers how to handle these types of situations. You're going to have to iterate with them. You're going to have to draw things out of them. Like all the examples I showed you of concealed conditions and building contingencies and best case, worst case, most likely case, every one of those examples took multiple discussions, multiple rounds of negotiation, and we had to coach that supplier through what we were looking for. And we also had to coach the internal project team about why this was so important to them and why we are helping them out from a procurement standpoint. So that does take some skill. It's not as easy as sometimes we hope it would be. But in the end, it's worth the effort because if you get this stuff addressed before the contract is signed, that's always good news. It's saving you change order issues later and getting ahead of things up front, which is ultimately what we want to start being known for in procurement within our organizations. I will also mention that this stuff gets into effective negotiation processes and procedures. I just want a friendly reminder here for you all that we've had somewhat of a series for the last year plus of negotiation topics. So I would recommend starting with this one from November of 2024, where we walk through our philosophy on the negotiation stage. And then there's a couple other, or 3 other examples of the type of things you might want to be negotiating for. Of course, one of those things would be known unknowns that we covered here today, but there's 3 other types that we've talked about in previous RFP Doctor sessions as well. So you can get there. Jake put the links into the chat there for you, which is great. And of course, on our main website, you can always see all of the recordings.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.